Good afternoon. I'm Alesa Loftus, and this is Jimmie Ratliff. We're coming to you live from Dynamic Independence here in Bartlesville. And today we're going to discuss reasonable accommodations in housing. So, if you have any questions during the live, just if you'll type them in down at the comments, we'll try to answer them for you now. And if we don't get them to them today, we can get the answers and we'll follow up after the live. So if you are seeing this and it's not live, you can still call us at 918-335-1314, or you can come by 1110 Southeast Frank Phillips Boulevard and ask us in person. So today, Jimmie, what is considered reasonable accommodation for housing?
Okay, so before we talked about reasonable accommodations in the workplace, and so this is kind of the next tier over from that. So reasonable accommodations in the work or in housing are changes or adjustments to rules, policies, practices, services, different things like that that may be necessary for an individual who has a disability to have an equal opportunity to enjoy their dwelling in their housing, and it also helps to eliminate barriers that allow full participation in the housing opportunities.
Okay. And who would be eligible for reasonable accommodations as it pertains to housing?
Okay, so individuals with disabilities, they are eligible for reasonable accommodations in housing, and these accommodations apply to both applicants for existing housing, so if you're applying to get housing, or if you're somebody who is already in a housing situation where you're renting or you're in an apartment or something like that. If you have a landlord and you need a reasonable accommodation later because you become disabled later, then you're also eligible to receive a reasonable accommodation.
Okay. So like an elderly or senior citizen that needed some kind of like shower rails or something installed, or somebody in a wheelchair that maybe needed a ramp, those would be somebody that would be the kind of accommodations or what would be eligible for those.
Right, that, absolutely, yeah. And those would be reasonable accommodations. They're things that would be easily implemented generally that could make their life easier and be more, maybe more mobile despite the disability.
Now, can a landlord ask for money, charge you anything for making the housing accommodative?
Accessible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, they can't. You cannot be charged a fee. So housing providers, and it's important to note that a housing provider, it can be just a regular landlord that you have, or it can be something like HUD, that the housing programs that they have there.
Mm.
These reasonable accommodations are not just particularly, well, if it's a government subsidized housing, or if it's something like that where it's an apartment complex or something. If you are an individual who has a landlord that's even like a private individual, you can also request reasonable accommodation. As long as they're a landlord, you can request that. It's not just for maybe HUD housing. So that being said, these housing providers cannot require individuals with disabilities to pay any kind of an extra fee or deposits, and they can't impose any other special conditions for that reasonable accommodation request. So if you come and say, I need, this grab bar in my restroom, to help me while I'm in the restroom, then they can't say, oh, well, your rent's going to go up because I had to do this, or you're going to have to pay a special deposit or a special fee. That's against the law.
Right. Okay. And I'm not sure if this has been addressed, if we had even thought about this before, but say someone lives in a second floor apartment,
Mm-hmm.
and then somehow maybe they have a stroke, and now they're going to be unable to take those stairs because they're going to need to be in a wheelchair or whatever.
Right.
So, and they ask for accommodations. They want it to move to a first story or the first floor.
Sure.
Okay. Obviously, they would have to wait for it to be available. I mean, it's not immediate if those apartments are all filled up. But can they charge you for accommodating for moving to that available first floor apartment, do you think?
So the answer generally would be no. They can't charge you for maybe accommodating you by moving you down to that floor. The only thing that I would see where that might be the case would be if, say, the apartments on the first floor were a different price for everyone anyway.
But if they were generally the same rent.
If it was the same rent
Right.
rate, and you had made this reasonable accommodation that you would like to be moved because you have this disability, then they could not charge you any more than what they would be charging anybody else to be there. So no, they cannot charge you an additional fee or fee just for moving you because it's a reasonable accommodation.
Okay. And you talked about what would be considered reasonable accommodations for housing, but can you give some specific examples of what those accommodations might look like?
Right, so we just gave one of those, and that was transferring maybe a tenant to the ground floor if they needed that type of accommodation to make it more accessible to them. Another thing would be permitting an assistance animal in a no-pet setting. And this might be a service dog, or it could be some other support animal that they have, like for emotional support. A lot of times in housing, that will apply also there, where those can be considered. But you can also, like we talked about, adding a grab bar to a restroom for help, while they're trying to get around the restroom. Maybe even adjusting a rent payment schedule if an individual, say, receiving Social Security benefits or Social Security disability benefits, and their check comes on the 25th of the month, and rent is due on the 15th of every month. A reasonable accommodation could be that an agreement is made that could coincide with when they receive their payment. That could be when their rent is due. So that's something. And then assigning accessible parking spaces to an individual who might have like a mobility impairment. So if they could park in this one place and make it easier for them to access the dwelling, then maybe assign that parking space there as an accessible space.
And can a housing provider deny your request for a reasonable accommodation? Like, for instance, can they say, no, we won't put in a grab bar, or we can't do the parking, provide an accessible parking space? Are they allowed to deny that?
So, under very limited circumstances, there can be denials that are made, but most generally the answer is no. If it's a reasonable accommodation that isn't, going to be a very large cost or something that's going to create an issue with the business as a whole, then reasonable accommodations are generally need to be met. So the circumstances where a reasonable accommodation request might be denied would be if there's no disability-related need for the accommodation. So if you don't have a disability, you go in, you go, I want to have a ramp to my house, and they can say, no, we're not doing that. So, or the request was not made by or on behalf of an individual with a disability who is living in the dwelling. Providing the accommodation would impose an undue financial or administrative burden on the housing provider. So if the accommodation was, the parking lot is rough and we need greater mobility in the parking lot, so we want the parking lot completely repaved, and that's going to cost $15,000 or $20,000. That's probably an undue hardship on the business. And then if that accommodation would fundamentally change the nature of the way that the housing provider provides their program, then that might be a reason why they would. But in general, small accommodations, and a lot of times small accommodations are really what's requested the most. That I need this bar installed. I need my service animal, or something like that. That would be most of the reasonable accommodations.
Something like maybe a higher toilet.
Yep. Right. Yeah. Something where they made some sort of accessible accommodation there.
Okay. So what can I do if a housing provider denies requested accommodation? Like, what steps can they take?
So first, that provider, if they're going to deny that, and even if they don't deny it, they need to be in discussions with whoever's making that request for an accommodation. They need to be in discussion with them and discuss, why it was denied, or discuss if there's any maybe alternative ideas for an accommodation that might meet the same accommodation, but might not necessarily be the original way that it was pitched to be done. So if you can find a middle ground there with an alternative reasonable accommodation, that's great. It's always best to try to resolve it with the landlord first. Now, if you've worked with your landlord or your housing provider and you're just not getting anywhere, and you ask for reasonable accommodation, you believe it's reasonable, and they're still denying it or they're not entertaining the idea at all, then you can file a complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. That's HUD. They have an Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, and they will review the evidence that you submit and assess whether the housing provider has violated the law. And then they can take steps or guide you on steps or actions that you can take at that point. An important thing, too, is to know that a housing provider has to provide prompt responses to reasonable accommodations. So if you do a reasonable accommodation request, they can't take months and months to look over it. They should be getting back to you fairly quickly and say, yes, that's something we can do, or no, we can't, but we could do this, or no, we can't and we're not, and here's why.
Okay.
And then it's essential that if you feel like that you're not being accommodated, that is discrimination. If it is a reasonable accommodation, and you need to file a complaint just as quickly after the incident of being denied, if you can't come to a successful resolution with the landlord, just as soon as you can. Just file the complaint immediately. And make sure that there's always a paper trail. We talked about this in accommodations for jobs as well. If you make a reasonable accommodation request, it's always a good idea to have that documented. Write it up in a letter, hand it to them, hand it to the landlord at the time you're making the request. Keep a copy for yourself. Note the date that was on there. Maybe even have a place for the landlord to sign on that, stating that I received a reasonable accommodation request from,
Right.
whoever on this date. And that way you do have a paper trail going back, so you can say, no, I made this request this date and it was denied, or no action has been taken. And that will just help the case later on if it does escalate to where a complaint is filed, so that some follow through can happen at that point.
Right. Okay. So I think that about covers our information that we have on the housing accommodations for today. We have placed in the link. Where was that information found at, Jimmie?
So it's actually on the HUD.gov website.
Okay.
And there's a bunch of little links and stuff after that, which I don't remember. So it's posted in the description for the video. You can click the link. It'll take you right there. It has all the information we've gone through and more. We've highlighted different things just to kind of give a broad overview. But again, like Alesa had said before, if you have any other questions about this process or a reasonable accommodation in housing or any of the videos that we do, be sure to post those in the comments, and we'll be happy to look into that for you and get back with you all.
Thank you, Jimmie, and thank you to all of our viewers. We hope that you have found our live today to be informative and that it's been helpful. And if there is any other questions that you all have about any of our lives, as always, feel free to contact us here at 918-335-1314 or come by at 1110 Southeast Frank Phillips Boulevard, Monday through Friday, 9 to 4. Have a good afternoon and a great week.
See you next time.